I'm a baseball fan. It's a baseball season. Anybody else out there, baseball fan? Few of you. Thankfully, my wife and my daughters are baseball fans too. I think my daughters are actually bigger baseball fans than my sons. And my daughter Maggie turns 21 on Tuesday. And so for Maggie's birthday trip, we went down to spring training, watched a Dodger game, saw a Reds-Padres game. Now, you got to know, as a kid, as a boy growing up in the Bay Area, I was a huge baseball fan. I'd go early to Oakland A's games and get autographs, and I knew the players. I knew what cars they drove. I tried to be polite as it was to the players and asking for autographs. And it was interesting as I watched this crowd of kids down at spring training just this past couple days, and they were crazy. I mean, they're yelling, they're screaming. It felt rude and annoying and obnoxious. And it actually made me think about this text that I knew we were approaching this morning. What do we do when it comes to Jesus? Do we push in and sort of with an annoyance go for what we know will bring us life and help and healing, as the woman did, who cut through the crowd and snuck up on Jesus and touched him, and she was healed? Or are we polite and, wait, as perhaps we saw Jairus do in this text? I wonder what the poll would be if I asked this room. Do you push in when you think about your relationship with Jesus, or do you just sort of wait and take things as they come? Because, he's busy. He's busy being king of the universe. We don't want to bother him. It reminded me of a parable that we find in Luke chapter 18. And I'll just read these first few verses of this. Luke 18, verses 2 to 5. Parable that Jesus told. He said, "In a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor respected man. There was a widow in that city who kept coming to him and saying, 'Give me justice against my adversary.' For a while he refused, but afterward he said to himself, 'Though I neither fear God nor respect man, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will give her justice, so that she will not beat me down by her continual coming.'" Verse 1, right before Jesus tells that parable, it says, "He told them a parable to the effect that they ought always to pray and not lose heart." It's strange to me in the Bible when Jesus uses, listen, he does this a few times. He uses the attitudes and the actions of the ungodly to teach his own disciples how they ought to act. A couple times he'll say things like, "The shrewd businessman is more committed to his business than you're committed to spiritual things." Here, this persistent widow is like constantly annoying Jesus, or the judge here, to get her questions answered, to get justice. Do you use that same kind of persistence as you approach prayer? So I'm going to take a page from Jesus' book and call this sermon "Bothering Jesus," like this widow bothered this judge. In our redemption group this past week, my brother Steve Pekovich alluded to what God has done over the years through Jim Cymbala and at the Brooklyn Tabernacle through a group of people who bothered Jesus in prayer. He said, "I don't want to just play at church. I want to be about seeking hard after God in prayer that he might do something great." And so we need to get to the heart of, I think, what Jesus is trying to teach us in this narrative, in this story. So let's get plugged back into the Gospel of Mark here for a minute, rehearse the big picture, and then see what it is that we can take away from this narrative. You remember that Jesus came preaching the gospel of what? The gospel of the kingdom. This is all about the king and the kingdom. He didn't come preaching the gospel of the church. He didn't come preaching, even as he describes it, the gospel of salvation, excuse me. He came preaching the gospel of the kingdom. He comes offering himself as the king. He comes inviting these followers into the kingdom. We see him throughout these opening chapters of Mark distinguish between the crowd. You remember the crowd who's following him, who wants him to perform miracles, and they find him interesting. And then at times he'll pull out the core. Of course, he draws his disciples. He spoke in parables so that while the crowd might understand general teaching, he would then pull the disciples aside to disciple the disciples, to give them the clear explanation that they needed to hear. We saw and have seen it up to this point in the Gospel of Mark where he would go away, say, into the desert versus where he would be in the villages and the cities. The distinctions between going away to pray and being in the battle of it. We saw just before he gets back in the boat and comes to Capernaum, where this incident with the woman who had been bleeding and Jairus and his dying daughter, we had seen him on the more rural side of the Sea of Galilee, and the man who was possessed by a legion of demons that he casts out into the pigs, and they go over the cliff into the sea. Where we've come in this recent account is Jesus displaying his power and authority first over creation. He calms the storm and uses the storm to expose what's in the disciples' hearts. Talked about how he's going somewhere with you. Sometimes he's taking you through a storm, but he's taking you somewhere. We then saw him, as it was with the authority and power over the demonic world. We spent some time talking about this real spiritual warfare that we're in, the real enemy against our souls. Power over creation, power over the enemy kingdom. And here we've seen power over disease, and what we'll see this morning, power over death. You say, how does understanding Jesus' power over all those things affect me? I'm not in a storm. I'm not demon-possessed. I'm not diseased or dying. Well, I hope that you can see, first of all, in some way, you are in all of those. You're in a storm. Things aren't going the way you thought they would go, and Jesus seems like he's asleep on you. And you wake him up to go, don't you care? Of course he does. He says, don't be afraid, just believe. Some of you are experiencing the oppression of the enemy. You're feeling the enemy world that we live in that is pressing against you. You're tempted to be squeezed into the mold of the culture. Some of you, I know, are fighting disease, even physical disease in your bodies. And though I don't know that anyone in our assembly is on their deathbed, of course we recognize we're all in the process of dying. And so this impacts all of us. And of course, what I hope you're also seeing is Jesus is never just interested in teaching crude, raw information or facts, but it's always about these human interactions, the lessons within the lessons. And so under the big picture of Jesus' power over disease and death that we see in this text, we're given two approaches to dealing with the authority of Jesus. And the first of which is keeping Jesus at a distance. Can I just ask you this morning, are you good at that? Are you good at keeping people at a distance? I'm not talking physically. I'm talking emotionally, spiritually. Your own self-protection. You're not going to be too vulnerable. You don't want to let on to too much weakness. You don't want to let some of the needy out. Your responses tend to be more, I'm fine, it's all good. Those curated responses, those tidy explanations, those maybe half-truths and selective sharing that just keep people at a distance. And you feel it and you hate it because you're like, I don't maybe have the kinds of friends that I wish I had, but You feel stuck in that. Maybe it's your unwillingness to receive input, and it makes people feel like they can't ever speak up, either to encourage you or to perhaps bring things to your attention. You're more intent on controlling the narrative, filling up the space of the conversation so that no one else gets a word in edgewise. Or perhaps it's just the opposite and you give those one-word answers. These and a myriad of other ways you have learned to keep people at a distance. Now, the first place that we see this in our text as this split screen of the bleeding woman that Jesus healed, and now Jairus and his daughter who's back home sick, is a delegation that comes from the synagogue ruler's house. In verse 35, it says, while he was still speaking, that is Jesus, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter's dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? This is what I would call the polite response that keeps Jesus at a distance. It's too late. Let's not be a bother. I'll just tell you, I've been polite like that before, but actually under the surface, there's a seething anger. I probably would be if I were Jairus, if I were this dad here too. Come on, Jesus. I got to you first. You agreed to go with me back to my house to heal my daughter. My daughter wasn't dead then, but now she is because you let this old woman cut in line. I'm just being honest. That's not fair. Can I just tell you, that's one of my knee-jerk responses in life. Anyone else? That's not fair. We were on our way, Jesus. You had said, yes, I'll go back to the house. My daughter wasn't dead. You delayed because she cut in front of me, and now she's dead. Oh, well. Now, I don't know what the tone of verse 35 was. Mine would have been with some underlying jaded seething. Something like, well, that's fine. That's fine. Let's just not bother the teacher anymore. There's nothing he can do. I mean, it's fine. There are those in the church who are quite polite and appear put together. And it may even be the fact that no harsh word comes out of their mouths, but they are about as far from Jesus as the moon is from the earth. Listen, God's timing is not our timing. Can you hear that? God's timing is not our timing. Maybe just even consider this from what I've already explained about the narrative. Maybe Jesus wants to accomplish something in your life, listen, that only a delay can accomplish. Now, it's easy for me to think about this in terms of well, maybe I missed that flight because there was something bad that was going to happen on the flight and God protected me. Or maybe I hit that red light because he was protecting me from an accident up ahead. But what if it is that answer in your life isn't coming? That prayer for your kid that you want to see happen isn't coming. The interviews for the job and it's not changing. What if the delay is actually part of God's plan to accomplish something in your life? Here, Jairus was like, this delay, that's fine. It's fine, Jesus. You chose. You chose the woman over my daughter. This polite response, whether it be with attitude like I'm representing or not, listen, it doesn't ruffle Jesus. And we're going to look at his response to that in a minute. But let's just see the next response that keeps Jesus at a distance. And it's found down in verse 38. This is the professional response. So drop down to verse 38. They get to the house. It says, they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. Now, this needs a little cultural background. These were not sad friends and family members of Jairus and the little girl, his daughter. These were hired professional mourners. Imagine auditioning for that job. Show me how you mourn. Can you weep? Give me your best weep and wail. Right? I don't know how you audition for that. But this was part of the custom and culture of this day. The Jewish regulations even, this is so crazy, they even described how many mourners you needed to hire and for how long they needed to go about their weeping and wailing. What has happened here, imagine this scene, right? What has happened here is that the funeral preparations are already in motion. The people back home have moved on from, maybe Jesus will heal her. Jairus is going to get Jesus. Maybe he'll come home and heal her too. She dead. And the scene is not about a group of people who are eagerly waiting for Jesus. It's not about a group of people who are earnestly seeking Jesus. He was their lucky charm that might have worked while she was still breathing. But now, well, that's past. And what we see here is it's cold and calculating, right? This is a seeking of Jesus like looking for a plumber or a doctor. It's just business. And listen, many are in the business of going to church. Maybe even week after week, like a blocked off spot on their calendar. And they approach it like going to the gym or going to the coffee shop on their way to work. I recently read an article, actually my wife passed an article on to me, where a mom goes to church. She's writing this article. She's a journalist. She's saying, I go to church for free childcare, coffee, and a little peace and quiet. There's a big church in the Southern California area. And she says, sometimes I go to church because I can sit outside and have my cup of coffee and I don't have to worry about my kids. And I don't really listen to the sermon, but it's really nice to sit outside and have my cup of coffee. And then some Sundays I go to yoga. Like it's yoga to clear my mind, or it's church to have some free childcare and clear my mind. It's cold. It's self-centered. I just call it, it's professional. It's professional. Like we see. These are just hired people to, it's just business. The third response that keeps Jesus at a distance is the most outwardly rude, but honestly no less offensive than these first two. And we see it in verses 39 and 40. This is the response of the mocker. And when he had entered the house, he said to them, why are you making commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And then look at it, verse 40. And they laughed at him. You can see it right there. 5 simple words. And they laughed at him. It doesn't need much explanation, does it? You know these folks. Objective truth is laughable. And certainly when someone isn't being logical or appears to push against what everyone else seems to take as truth, right? Jesus says, she's not dead, she's sleeping. Our culture today laughs at things that we say and hold as objective truth, don't they? There is a general disdain and mocking from our culture towards those who believe the Bible is authoritative, inerrant truth. One author recently described it as the church in the negative world. But listen, we do it too. When I think I'm right and you are wrong, I sneer under my breath. I chuckle. You do it towards Jesus too. What's interesting is the unlikely heroes in the stories of these accounts with Jesus and parables, right? The bleeding woman didn't do that. She came up and touched Jesus. The persistent widow in the parable, she didn't sneer and mock and laugh. She just kept coming to the judge. The religious of Jesus' day did. And we do it too. It's like treating someone as stupid beneath us. We mock them. Usually it's internally, but sometimes it leaks out, doesn't it? And whether it be polite or professional or like this, the mocker, listen, repentance is the only remedy. Repentance that leads to faith. And that is entering into life with Jesus. So the one approach is maybe one that you've gotten good at, and maybe you could add others that aren't even seen in the text there. It's keeping Jesus and maybe keeping others at a distance. Or the other response is, here's the man with power and authority. I want to bother him. I want to enter into life with him. I want to earnestly seek him. I thought this morning of, remember in the Old Testament where Jacob is wrestling with the angel and he says, I'm not going to let you go until you give me a blessing. Do you think about entering into a relationship with Jesus that way? Is it too polite? It's too pedestrian and mundane? Do you know how to do this with people? How to enter into life with them? Rather than keeping people at a distance, you actually enter into life with them. You hear their story. You meet their people. You learn the design of their hearts. And over time, they feel you to be a safe place where they can be known, where they're loved, where they belong. It takes work. It takes intention. And it does too with Jesus. Take a look first at what we see, how he responds to the polite push-off. He first calls Jairus into faith. Verse 36, they had just said, why trouble the teacher anymore? She's dead. Don't bother him. It's fine. He chose the woman over you and your daughter. Let's just head home. And Jesus overhears this, verse 36. But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. Jesus hears these attendants who are intent on following, Jairus, who's an important person, and the delegation that had been sent from the house. And he says, Jairus, look at me. Takes his face, and he says his 5 words against their 5 words. He says, do not fear, only believe. There's two commands there. They're present imperatives in the text. Basically, first he says, ignore them. They're about creating fear. I've had to take this one to heart a lot. It's really easy to consider those in your life, those circumstances, those people that want to create fear, cause worry, anxiety. Jesus says to you, like he says to Jairus, ignore that. Ignore that. Don't fear. Trust me. That's the next thing he said. Trust me. I've got something better for you. Even though things don't seem like they're going right now, you feel like I let this woman cut in line and your daughter's dead and you're ready to just, not going to bother you. Don't do that. Don't let fear control you. Just believe. You're mad at this bleeding woman, but did you even stop long enough to see that I healed her? And I've still got something in store for you. I'm working here for you. I love what Sinclair Ferguson says, just so simply, true faith grows by testing. And this is one of those spiritual axioms that I just wish weren't true. But even as I look around this room, I know it to be true. Your faith has grown through trials. Your faith has grown through testing. This test that God, the Son, put Jairus to was simply a delay. Are you gonna brush me off? Or are you gonna hold on and have faith? There's a phrase, excuse me, that we use a lot in our home. Here it is. Ready? Trust God and do the next thing. Trust God and do the next thing. You're so concerned about the next 10 things that need to happen, and you're freaking out about them because you don't know how you're going to work out all those things, and you don't know what the outcome is of those things, and you can't control those things. So just stop letting fear and worry control you, and just do the next thing. Just do the next thing that you know God's called you to do. Jairus, you came here to ask me for help. Keep doing that. I'm with you. I'm walking back to your house with you right now. Don't be afraid. Just keep believing. Now, I want you to see this next call of God thoughtfully. Watch what Jesus does when they get to the house. Verse 40 and 41. After they laughed at him, those professional mourners, it says, but he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him. Who were with him? Well, it says back up in verse 37 that he allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John. So it says, he took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, Peter, James, and John, and went in where the child was. Verse 41, taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha Kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. So not only does entering into life with Jesus mean that you're going to be called into faith, but listen, you're going to also be called into death. A crowd follows him. He pulls Peter, James, John, mom and dad, and he takes them into the room where the daughter lies dead. I don't know if you've ever been in the room of someone who was dead. I'll never forget the first time that it happened to me. Some of you are in the medical field. You probably see this all the time. As a pastor, I remember being invited into the home of a man in our church who was on his deathbed, and his wife was there, and he had passed somewhere between me getting the phone call and me getting to the house. And first I meet and greet the woman and hug her, and then she says something like, do you want to go see him? I'm literally freaking out like, well, he's dead. What am I going to say to him, right? I mean, I walk into the room and I'm faced with this like, I don't want to be rude and not go sort of be respectful to the fact that he has just passed, but I also care more about her than what's happening over in this bed where he's now lifeless. It's uncomfortable. There is a spiritual principle in here that I don't want you to miss. Jesus calls us into death so that he can give us life. Now, they laugh at him because he says, oh, she's not dead, she's just sleeping. Well, now, this is Jesus teaching all of us how he thinks of physical death. For all of us, whether we're believers or unbelievers, physical death is not the end. There is another death. And he says all will rise, and it will either be to judgment or it will be to reward. And so Jesus is just saying, look, physical death is not the end. There is something greater for all that is yet to come. And he comes into the room, and there's mom and dad and Peter, James, and John. And if they're like me, they're probably... well, mom and dad are probably close to their daughter, and Peter, James, and John are back a bit. And Jesus goes right over to this little girl, and he says these two words, Talitha Kumi, little girl, arise. Or actually, Talitha is the word that is like lamb, little lamb, young one. How tender is that? My little lamb, get up. He has shown his tenderness to the woman who's been bleeding for 12 years, and she's exhausted all of her resources. She's been to doctor after doctor, hasn't been healed. And her faith to cut through the crowd and touch Jesus, and immediately she's healed. And now he shows the tenderness to this 12-year-old girl It's actually the only instance in the Gospel of Mark where it's recorded that Jesus raises someone from the dead. Now we know that he raised Lazarus from the dead, but Mark doesn't record that. Mark is including this to alert our attention to the significance of this event. This is how important this scene is in our understanding of the power of Jesus. Friends, life comes out of death. Of course, it's a salvation metaphor, right? Jesus enters into the room. He enters into death with her, to bring her out of the room with life, new life that has been secured by him. Again, he's not afraid of becoming unclean, whether it is the woman who's unclean touching him or it's him touching now a dead body. He's not afraid of entering into death for her or in a few short months for mom and dad and Peter, James, and John and for you. His death, the death of Christ, my friends, it always is to produce in us a death to self. A death to self. So that we might know his life. A death to us trying to save ourselves. A death to us trying to be the boss of our own lives. One author says it this way. At each stage of spiritual growth, more self-denial is required. More painful blows to self, more reckless decisions to serve the Lord Christ with consequent abandonment of one's own life. Being a disciple, Jesus is teaching his disciples, it means you're going to be called to faith. I don't get it. I don't know how it's working, but I'm not going to be afraid, and I'm going to choose to trust you. And as I trust you, I know that I'm saying yes to you and no to my own life. I'm saying death to self and more of Jesus. Lastly, entering into life with Jesus is being called into awe. Look at verse 42. Immediately, the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. He strictly charged them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. Immediately. This is Mark's favorite word. We've mentioned this a number of times in this gospel. He says, immediately the girl got up and immediately they were overcome with amazement. See, this is always the outcome of faith and death. Listen. When you lose yourself, you gain Christ. And when you gain Christ, you gain everything. I always find it interesting that this feature of Mark 2 where we've seen it and he tells people, some people he tells, go tell everybody. And other people he says, don't tell anyone. Well, here he says, again, to not tell them. Well, of course, it's not that they won't know. They're all waiting outside. They know the girl's dead. What, are they going to sneak out a trap door in the house? At some point, they're going to know what happened here, that this woman, that this little girl was raised to life. What's the point? Well, the point is always that Jesus gives truth to those who have soft hearts and want to enter into life with him. He knows that crowd out there is a mocking crowd. They're an unbelieving crowd. He says, of course the word's going to get out, but I'm just not interested in throwing, as we might use what he talks about earlier, my pearls before swine. I care, you have witnessed this. Don't let the mocking crowd destroy the faith and life that you now have. And then I love how human this is. As it closes, he says, he told them to give her something to eat. Give her something to eat. I mean, mom's probably, oh, yeah, of course. I'll go grab something. I can make her favorite meal. She's alive. Worship is never divorced from the reality of life on a broken planet. We don't ignore hurts. We don't ignore hurts with raised hands of ignorance. Can I just say this as boldly as I can? Shame on the church that is worshiping with raised hands and loud voices, but then on Monday morning we don't care about the orphan and the widow. Shame on us if our worship in this room looks full of passion and full of delight, and then we're unmoved when we're driving through LA and we see the homeless. That's it. Look, we bring life to worship, and we bring worship to all of life. Here they're amazed that Jesus has just raised this little girl from the dead, and as opposed to just having some praise service, he says, now get her something to eat. It's just so human and everyday about how we're supposed to live our lives. So, is it going to be, my friends, don't bother Jesus, keep him at a distance, or is it going to be enter into life with him? If I recall, there was another biblical father who was put to the test back in Genesis chapter 22 when God tells Abraham to take his only son Isaac up to Mount Moriah, and Abraham packs the wood and he holds Isaac's hand and they walk up, and Isaac says, Dad, what are we going to sacrifice? Well, Abraham knows that he's about ready to, in faith, sacrifice his son because God told him, I don't get this, but I'm not going to be afraid. I'm going to believe. Of course, they get up to the top and God provides a lamb. He sacrifices the lamb. And see, Abraham was another father with his child who was called to enter into faith, enter into death, and then enter into awe and worship. In just a few minutes, we're going to celebrate the Lord's table, which is another father with a son who gave his son to death so that we could enter into life. Isn't it beautiful when you see these redemptive themes throughout Scripture? There's a posture that I try to practice regularly, both figuratively and sometimes just actually physically. It's this. Open hands. Sometimes when someone's praying for me, I'll just open my hands. I want to receive the prayer that this person is praying for. Or sometimes when I'm just praying, because it reminds me, Lord, I trust you. I trust you. I give you my heart. I give you my life. I give you my child. I give you my day. I give. Sometimes it's just, Lord, I give. I die daily. I relinquish control to you. Let me just finish with this brilliant quote by Elizabeth Elliot. And then we're going to sing in response to worship. Elizabeth Elliot says this: open hands should characterize the soul's attitude toward God. What is that, Elizabeth? Open to receive what he wants to give, open to give back what he wants to take. Acceptance of the will of God means relinquishment of our own. If our hands are full of our own plans, there isn't room to receive his. Lord, thanks for the opportunity to learn from Jesus, Jairus, this little girl, this old woman. Thank you for the simple words that Jesus gave to Jairus, that he gives to us today. Do not fear, only believe. Lord, as we come to a time of song and a time around the Lord's table, a time of prayer and confession, would you do a work in my heart? Would you do a work in each heart in this room? Would you do a work in the kids that are here as they witness and participate and see what it is to be about worship? So God, I just commit these next few minutes now to you. In Christ's name.